It was a typical Wednesday morning in the city. The sun shone brightly, casting long shadows on the sidewalks as people rushed to start their workday. The usual hustle and bustle of the city filled the air with energy, but little did anyone know, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would change the course of history at a local bank. An old man, hunched over with the weight of age, shuffled down the street towards the grand doors of the bank. His clothes were ragged, and his hat was faded from years of use. He held a sack in his hand, which looked far too heavy for a man of his years. His steps were slow but deliberate, each movement showing a quiet determination. The people walking by paid him no mind. Some avoided him, others glanced away, brushing off the strange figure as just another homeless soul, someone who didn't quite belong in the modern world. Inside the bank, things were buzzing. The employees moved swiftly, answering phone calls, working on computers, and assisting customers who lined up at the counters. The usual hum of a busy weekday carried on as expected, with the routine of business as usual. However, the calm of the morning was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. As the old man reached the entrance, he pushed the door open, and the soft jingle of the bell above the door rang through the quiet space. The noise was enough to capture attention. The few people who were in line stopped mid-conversation, their eyes turning toward the entrance. It wasn't his age that caught their attention, nor his appearance. It was something about his aura, something that hinted at more than what met the eye. People felt an inexplicable shift in the room. The air seemed to thicken as he stepped into the bank, his every movement slow and steady. His weathered face revealed nothing, yet it spoke volumes to those who dared to look. Inside, the young teller behind the counter raised an eyebrow at the sight of the man. She had seen plenty of odd customers, but this one was different. His ragged clothes and tired eyes did not belong in the pristine, polished environment of a financial institution. She smiled politely, masking her surprise. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, trying to maintain her professionalism, though her confusion was evident. Without answering, the old man simply walked up to the counter. His hands, gnarled by age and years of hard work, gripped the sack tightly, as though it were an extension of himself. He placed it gently on the counter, its weight clearly evident even from a distance. The teller blinked and looked down at the sack, then back at the man, still unsure of what was going on. But the old man said nothing, he simply waited, his eyes fixed on her. His expression was calm, almost serene, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. "Yes," the old man finally spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying a weight that no one expected. "I own this bank." For a moment, there was a stunned silence in the room. The words hung in the air, like a challenge no one was ready to accept. And then, as if on cue, the room erupted into laughter. The bank staff, the customers in line, all of them broke out in fits of chuckles. The notion that this frail, elderly man could possibly own the bank was absurd. It didn't make sense. He didn't look like someone who could afford a cup of coffee, let alone a multi-million-dollar financial institution. The laughter rippled through the room, almost echoing off the walls. The teller, struggling to maintain composure, tried to keep her professional mask on, but even she couldn't help but chuckle softly. Her eyes darted nervously to her colleagues, who stood by, watching the bizarre scene unfold. "Sir, I'm afraid you must be mistaken," the teller said, trying to regain control of the situation. Her tone was firm now, her professionalism slipping slightly as she tried to make sense of the impossible claim. "This is a reputable institution. There's no way you own this bank." The old man didn't flinch. He didn't seem bothered by the laughter at all. Instead, he remained calm, his hands still resting on the sack. Slowly, he looked around at the staff, who had all now gathered in a small circle around the counter. There were murmurs among them. Some exchanged skeptical glances, others whispered behind their hands. The atmosphere had shifted from amusement to doubt. The old man waited for a few moments before speaking again. "I know it's hard to believe," he said softly, "but I've owned this bank for over 30 years. Now, the laughter began to die down, replaced by disbelief. The teller's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at the sack once again. What was in it? What was this man trying to show her? The room, once filled with laughter and skepticism, now became eerily quiet. The old man leaned forward, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he unzipped the sack. From it, he pulled out a bundle of papers, neatly wrapped with a string. He placed the bundle on the counter and pushed it toward the teller, who hesitated before picking it up. "This," the old man said, "is all the proof you need." As the teller unwrapped the papers, her eyes quickly scanned the top document. Her heart began to race. These weren't ordinary papers. They were legal documents, ownership certificates, bank records, signed contracts. All of them clearly stamped with the name of the old man at the top. The details were undeniable. She looked at the other employees, who were watching intently now. Some of them took a cautious step forward to see for themselves, their skepticism turning to curiosity. No one was laughing anymore. This can't be," the teller whispered, barely able to comprehend what she was seeing. The documents were real. The man wasn't just some vagabond making a wild claim. He actually did own the bank. The old man's smile was almost imperceptible, but it was there. He knew what would happen next. He knew that in a world driven by appearances, people would always underestimate the power of those who kept their strength hidden. And now, in this very moment, they were seeing him for who he truly was. Not a homeless man, but the quiet force behind an institution. The bank had laughed at him once, but now they had no choice but to listen. Despite the laughter, the old man stood his ground, unmoved by the ridicule and disbelief that surrounded him. The noise of mocking chuckles continued, but it was as though he didn't hear it at all. His eyes were calm, focused, and unwavering. Slowly, without haste, he reached down to the sack in his hands and began to untie it. The crowd around him grew restless, some still laughing, others shifting uncomfortably, unsure of what was about to unfold. But the old man, with his wrinkled hands, moved with a steady precision that only someone who knew exactly what they were doing could achieve. He pulled open the sack, and from within, he drew out a bundle of papers. The papers were old, yellowed with time, but still neatly tied together with a string. With an almost practiced motion, he placed the bundle gently on the counter in front of the young teller. The papers made a soft rustling sound as they settled on the wood. "Take a look," he said calmly, his voice low but resolute. "You'll find all the proof you need." The teller paused for a moment, her brow furrowed in confusion. She had been prepared to continue with the banter, to gently redirect this eccentric old man to the door where he could be on his way. But something about his demeanor had shifted the energy in the room. It wasn't just the calmness in his voice, but the quiet authority in his presence. The laughter around her died down, and even the most skeptical bank customers began to pay attention. Curiosity began to eat away at her initial doubts. She hesitated but then reached forward, picking up the bundle with tentative fingers. She unwrapped it slowly, her eyes scanning the first document. As she flipped through the pages, one by one, she was met with something she hadn't expected, something that would change everything. The papers were real. They weren't some random scribblings or childish forgeries. They were legal documents, meticulously organized, ownership certificates, transaction records, bank contracts, each stamped with the name of the old man, the very same name he had spoken just moments before. Her breath caught in her throat. She quickly scanned the documents again, her mind struggling to process the reality unfolding before her. The name on the papers was unmistakable, the old man's name, boldly and clearly printed on every page. As her eyes traveled down each sheet, she could see the signatures, the legal jargon, and the bank's own seal, all confirming that this man, with his humble appearance, had indeed been behind the ownership of this very institution for decades. She looked up at him, her face pale, then glanced back at the papers as if trying to convince herself she wasn't imagining things. The entire room, which had once been filled with laughter and incredulity, had fallen silent. The old man's calm gaze met hers, and in his eyes, there was no hint of arrogance, only quiet confidence, as if he knew the truth was finally about to be revealed to everyone. The teller's hands trembled as she looked back down at the documents. She could feel her pulse quicken. These are legitimate," she whispered under her breath, almost in disbelief. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. She was no longer doubting the authenticity of the papers. What she couldn't wrap her head around was how this man, so plainly dressed and seemingly invisible to the world, could have possibly kept such a monumental secret for so long. At that moment, the entire room seemed to freeze. The bank staff who had once snickered, the customers who had sneered, all stood in stunned silence. No one spoke, as if they were waiting for some further explanation or perhaps even an apology from the old man for the confusion. But there was no apology coming. He wasn't a frail old man who had lost his grip on reality. He was not just a beggar in ragged clothes. He was the owner of the very bank they stood in, and the realization hit everyone like a bolt of lightning. "I told you," the old man said, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His voice was gentle, but there was a quiet authority in his words. I've owned this bank for over 30 years. The room was still, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Where there had once been mockery and disbelief, there was now a thick, suffocating sense of awe. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by a sense of reverence. The young teller, still holding the bundle of papers, looked at the old man as if seeing him for the first time. What had once been dismissed as the ramblings of a madman had now become a tangible reality. The old man had, in fact, owned the bank for more than 3 decades, and everything about his humble appearance now seemed to make perfect sense. For the first time, the employees in the room began to look at him differently. The manager, who had been watching from his office, now slowly approached the counter, his expression filled with disbelief. His eyes shifted between the old man and the papers, his mouth slightly open. The other staff, who had once been skeptical, now exchanged nervous glances. You. The manager started, his voice catching in his throat. How did we not know? The old man's smile didn't fade. I've always preferred to stay in the background, he said with a quiet chuckle. I've seen how things work here. It's never been about the money or the prestige for me. It's about making sure things run smoothly for those who really need it. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't because of disbelief. It was because the old man's words had settled in, and they made sense. The bank, now operating under his ownership for over 3 decades, had been successful, not because of flashy marketing or public recognition, but because it had always focused on providing genuine service to the community. His absence from the spotlight had been intentional. The people around him hadn't recognized him not because he was invisible, but because he had never wanted recognition. His wealth and success had always been secondary to his desire to make a real difference. And so, in that moment, the staff and customers of the bank understood that the old man, with his humble appearance and quiet dignity, had been the one pulling the strings all along. The laughter from moments before was replaced by a deep respect, as the truth of who he really was finally became clear to all. The old man didn't need to say much more. His presence, his confidence, and his quiet authority had already done the work for him. As the shock began to settle in, the old man took a deep breath and began to share his story. His voice, though quiet, was filled with the weight of years of experience. It was a voice that seemed to carry the wisdom of someone who had seen both the highs and lows of life, and someone who had learned not just from successes, but from every mistake and failure along the way. He spoke without any airs of arrogance, only with the calm certainty that he was finally revealing the truth after decades of silence. It wasn't always like this, the old man began, his eyes distant, as if he was traveling back in time. When I first started out, I wasn't rich, and I wasn't powerful. I was just a young man with a dream, a vision of a future where I could make something of myself. But it didn't come easy. Nothing ever does. He paused for a moment, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the counter as he searched for the right words. The teller, still holding the documents, leaned in slightly, captivated by his words. So did everyone else in the room? They were no longer focused on the man's clothes or his age. They were listening to him with rapt attention, hanging on to every word. You see, when I started in finance, it wasn't about getting rich quick, he continued, his voice steady. I worked my way up, from the bottom to where I could start making the kind of moves that would eventually lead to something bigger. Over the years, I learned one thing above all else: patience. You can't rush anything, especially not success. And success, when it comes, is always built on a foundation of sound judgment and careful planning. He paused again, his eyes reflecting a mixture of nostalgia and determination. The people in the room, who had once dismissed him as a frail, old man with nothing of significance, now hung on his every word. They could hear the truth in his voice, the sincerity behind his recounting of his life's journey. I didn't spend my money recklessly. I saved every penny I could, always careful with my investments, the old man said, his voice tinged with a hint of pride. There were plenty of opportunities for me to spend it on luxuries, to show off like others did. But I knew what I was working toward. I was building something bigger than just a personal fortune. I was building a future, a legacy. The room was silent now, each person lost in their own thoughts, trying to grasp the enormity of what the old man was saying. They had thought of him as an afterthought, a random figure with no place in their world. But now, it was becoming clear that he had been quietly orchestrating something far larger than anyone could have imagined. When the bank was struggling, when it was on the brink of collapse, Most people saw it as a lost cause, he said, his voice soft but resolute. They wrote it off, decided that it was too far gone to save. But I saw something different. I saw an opportunity, not just to make money, but to do something important, to save something that mattered. The old man's words were powerful, and for the first time, the people in the room realized just how much foresight, strategy, and cunning had been involved in his success. The bank was drowning in debt, he continued, his tone steady as ever. It was a sinking ship, and no one had the will or the vision to turn it around. But I had been watching for years, seeing the cracks, the mismanagement, the potential. I knew that with the right moves, I could turn it into something better. The people around him listened intently as he explained how, in the quietest of ways, he had swooped in. I didn't make a big show of it. I didn't make headlines or wave my arms in front of cameras, he said, his voice becoming more firm. I bought the bank's debt, one piece at a time, through legal channels and obscure deals that no one else had the patience or foresight to pursue. I slowly gained control, bit by bit, without anyone knowing who was behind it. As he spoke, the realization hit everyone. The old man hadn't just bought the bank out of nowhere. He had invested time, effort, and patience into something that others had given up on. He hadn't taken a sudden leap into wealth. He had built his fortune piece by piece, staying hidden in the background, making the right decisions when others had turned away. For years, no one knew who was really running the show, the old man continued, his tone matter-of-fact. The bank operated under new management, with no one ever suspecting that I was the one behind the scenes. I preferred it that way. I didn't need the spotlight. I didn't need fame. I just wanted to make sure things were being done right. He gave a small, almost wistful smile. I've never been one for attention. I don't need people to know who I am or what I've done. What mattered to me was making sure that the bank was serving its purpose, helping people, providing the services they needed, and doing it all without unnecessary drama. I've always believed in letting the work speak for itself. The room was silent again, and the gravity of his words sank in. The old man wasn't just a financial mastermind. He was someone who believed in doing things the right way, someone who preferred to work quietly in the background, ensuring that the right decisions were being made. He had never cared for recognition or accolades. All he cared about was ensuring that things ran smoothly and that the people who depended on the bank received the services they deserved. I've always been content with being invisible, the old man said with a shrug, as if the notion of fame had never even occurred to him. What's important to me is that the people who needed this place could count on it. That's the legacy I wanted to leave behind. For the first time, the staff and customers of the bank understood. They had been judging him based on his appearance, his age, his clothing. But none of that had mattered. The old man had been quietly shaping their world, making decisions that had impacted thousands of lives, all while staying out of the spotlight. And now, as he stood before them, his story was clear. He was not just the owner of a bank, he was a man of vision, a man who had worked tirelessly to make sure that things were done right, for the people who truly mattered. The teller, still holding the bundle of papers in her hands, blinked in disbelief. Her mind raced, trying to process the shock of what had just happened. She had never imagined that a normal day at the bank would take such an unexpected and surreal turn. Her fingers trembled slightly as she glanced back down at the documents, now laid out in front of her on the counter. The pages were undeniable: legal certificates, contracts, ownership records, all with the name of the old man clearly stamped at the top. She felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest, the gravity of the truth now sinking in. She looked around at her colleagues, who were still standing frozen, their expressions a mix of confusion, disbelief, and astonishment. They too were trying to process what had just been revealed to them. The laughter and ridicule that had initially filled the room had evaporated entirely. In its place was a stunned silence, a collective moment of realization that they were witnessing something far bigger than any of them had expected. Is this real? One of the other employees whispered, her voice barely audible. She had worked at the bank for years, but she had never imagined that the old man, the one who looked so out of place in his ragged clothes, could possibly have anything to do with the ownership of this institution. The question hung in the air, unspoken for a moment, but then it seemed to echo around the room. No one knew what to think, and no one dared to move. The teller's mind spun as she searched for answers, but no explanation seemed to make sense. Her initial skepticism had been replaced with something akin to awe. She had watched the old man quietly reveal his true identity, and now all she could do was stare at the papers in her hands. The reality of the situation was difficult to grasp, but it was undeniable. As if summoned by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the bank manager, who had been in his office during the initial exchange, rushed out into the main area. His footsteps echoed in the now silent bank as he approached the counter. He was visibly shaken, his face pale as he took in the sight of the old man standing calmly before them. The sack, which had caused so much confusion earlier, still rested on the counter, its contents laid out before him. The manager's eyes flickered from the old man to the documents and back to the teller, whose hands were still clutching the papers in disbelief. "Sir, is this true?" the manager asked, his voice trembling slightly as he addressed the old man. His normally confident demeanor had vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and uncertainty. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of the revelation. The employees and customers, all of whom had been so sure that the old man was nothing more than a wandering soul, now stood frozen, waiting for an answer. The old man didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady and calm, his hands still resting lightly on the counter. There was no hint of arrogance in his posture, no smugness to be found. He simply nodded, as if the truth was as plain as day, something that had always been there, just waiting for others to see. "It is," he said quietly, his voice clear and firm. "And it's time for you all to realize who's been behind this place all along." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. The manager, his face still pale, took a step back, clearly struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just heard. His mind raced, searching for some explanation, some reason to dismiss the reality that had just been laid out before him. But there was no denying it. The documents were real, and the old man wasn't bluffing. He had owned the bank for decades, quietly managing it from the shadows, and now the truth was impossible to ignore. The employees exchanged uncertain glances, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Some looked to the manager for guidance, while others seemed paralyzed by the revelation. No one knew what to do next. The idea that this frail, elderly man, who had seemed like an afterthought just moments ago, was actually the true owner of the bank was almost too much to process. The manager swallowed hard, his throat dry. He took a step closer to the old man, his voice now more measured but still filled with disbelief. How did we never know?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "All these years, how did you manage to stay hidden?" The old man's eyes softened slightly, and he smiled, a faint, knowing smile. "I didn't need to be known," he said, his voice steady but filled with quiet pride. "I didn't want the fame or the recognition. I didn't need anyone to know who I was or what I had done. What mattered was the work, the people, and making sure that this place ran as it should." The room was silent again, the weight of his words settling in. It was clear now that the old man had never sought attention. He hadn't wanted to be in the spotlight. He had built his wealth and control over the bank through patience, strategy, and hard work, all while staying behind the scenes. And in doing so, he had ensured that the bank operated with integrity, that it served the community in the way it was meant to. For the first time, the employees began to look at him differently. The old man was no longer just a stranger with a sack. He was the embodiment of everything they had been working for, the invisible force that had shaped the success of the bank for years. The bank had flourished under his leadership, and now they saw the truth. He was not just the owner of the bank, but the one who had guided it to where it was today, without ever asking for recognition or praise. "All these years," the manager muttered, still processing the information. "You've been right here, running everything, and we never knew. We never suspected." The old man nodded again. "I've always preferred to stay out of the way," he said. "The work speaks for itself. It's not about who I am or what I've done. It's about what this bank represents and how it helps people." The truth had finally come to light, and the old man's quiet wisdom and strength had reshaped everything the employees thought they knew about the world around them. They were no longer just employees at a bank. They were part of something much bigger, something far more meaningful than they could have ever imagined. And as the old man stood there, surrounded by people who had once doubted him, he knew that the time had come for them all to see the bigger picture. The time had come for them to realize that, behind every successful venture, there are forces at work that go unnoticed, waiting to make their impact in ways no one ever expects. As the news spread throughout the bank, a palpable shift in the atmosphere took place. What had begun as a moment of laughter and mockery had quickly transformed into a realization of respect and awe. Employees, who just moments ago had dismissed the old man as nothing more than a curious oddity, now looked at him with newfound reverence. No longer did they see him as a frail, inconspicuous figure with ragged clothes. Instead, they saw a man who had silently built his empire, a man who had been behind the scenes, pulling the strings and shaping the bank's success without ever needing to be in the spotlight. The old man stood at the center of it all, calm and composed, knowing that he had just revealed his truth, and with it, had earned a respect that couldn't be manufactured. The bank staff, once skeptical and even dismissive, now felt the weight of what had just unfolded. The old man wasn't some delusional character. He was the true architect of the bank's prosperity. They had underestimated him, judging him based solely on his appearance. But now they realized that true power and influence don't always come with flashy displays or grandiose gestures. Sometimes, true strength comes in the form of quiet persistence and humility. In the midst of the newfound respect, the old man did not let the situation get to his head. Despite the change in how he was being treated, he remained humble. He had no desire for power or recognition. His days of leadership were behind him. He had come to the bank not to take control or to demand the limelight, but to make sure that his legacy lived on in the right way. "I don't want to run the bank," he said, his voice calm but firm. "That's not why I'm here. You all have been doing good work. I have no interest in taking that from you. I just want to make sure that the future remains true to the principles that matter most." The employees were caught off guard by his words. They had expected him to take charge, to demand more recognition, or even a leadership position. But instead, the old man was offering something far more valuable: his trust and the freedom for them to continue running things as they always had, with a single condition. "I've seen this place grow over the years," he continued, looking around at the staff who had once doubted him. "I've watched you all work hard, day in and day out, and I respect that. But there's one thing I ask of you, a promise, that no matter what happens, the needs of the people will always come first. This bank exists for them, not for the bottom line or the prestige of its owners. If you promise me that, I'll step back into the shadows where I belong." The room fell silent as the gravity of his words sank in. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the power. The old man wasn't asking for control. He was asking for a commitment to the people who had relied on the bank for years, perhaps without ever knowing who truly owned it. This was a man who had built an empire, not for himself, but to serve others. The employees looked at each other, and without a word spoken, they all knew that they had just been given a rare gift, a vision that transcended mere business or profit. They had been granted a purpose, a direction that would guide their work not just for the bank's success, but for the success of everyone who walked through its doors. And so, the old man's legacy continued, not with a grand announcement or a flashy takeover. There were no press conferences or public celebrations. His power did not need to be paraded for the world to see. Instead, it carried on quietly, as it always had, through the work being done day by day, in the dedication of the staff, and in the integrity of the institution they served. It was the quiet assurance that sometimes true power lies in what is done in the shadows, away from the public eye, where the real work happens. As the old man turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at the staff one final time. He could see the shift in their eyes, the respect that had replaced their earlier skepticism. He smiled, not out of pride, but because he knew he had made the right decision. The bank, in his eyes, had always been a tool for the greater good. Now, it would continue in that purpose, driven by the principles he had instilled in it without ever needing to show his face again. "Take care of it," he said simply, his voice full of quiet confidence. "And remember, it's never about who's in charge. It's about what we do for the people who depend on us." The door swung closed behind him, and the staff stood there, silently absorbing the moment. For some, it was a lesson in humility and perception, never to judge someone based on appearance or assumption. For others, it was a reminder of why they had entered the business in the first place, to make a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. In the end, everyone who had laughed at him, who had doubted him, learned a valuable lesson: never judge a book by its cover. The old man with the sack, who had been mocked and dismissed, had claimed ownership of a bank, and with it, the respect of everyone who had once questioned him. The true measure of a person's worth, they now knew, is not in their outward appearance, but in the quiet power they wield when no one is looking. The bank would continue to thrive, not because of any grand announcement or flashy takeover, but because it was built on the kind of integrity and vision that lasts long after the spotlight fades. The end. Imagine walking into a bank, and an old man with a sack claims he owns the entire place. Laughter fills the room, but when the truth is revealed, everything changes. What if the most powerful person in the room has been hiding in plain sight the entire time? Stay with me to uncover the shocking story of a man who turned mockery into respect and changed the game without anyone even noticing.